Hello, as you know, I'm Roger Watson. I met you in real time in the last session, and this is the second in 3 presentations about writing for publication. I'm unable to be with you this time, so this is a recording, and I'm doing that because as I'm speaking to you here today, I'll be flying back to the United Kingdom from North America, where I've been at a conference. The next session will be in real time. So as you know, I'm one of the academic deans at Southwest Medical University in Luzhou, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of Nurse Education in Practice. Today I'm going to talk about manuscript organization. What I want to do today is to give you some tips on manuscript organization. Now, there's a fairly standard way of organizing manuscripts which is used across all journals. They're not all exactly the same, but they do follow a similar pattern, and it looks a bit like this. First of all, manuscripts must all have a title. They must have an abstract, then an introduction or a background, and perhaps both, a methods section, a results section, a discussion section, a conclusion, and of course following that at the end, a list of references. Now, this is the usual order in which these sections are presented in a typical academic manuscript. However, it can differ slightly between journals. And what I would urge you to do, and I'll come back to this point later, are 2 things. One, always check the guidance for the journal to see what the order of the contents should be, and take a look at some typical manuscripts in the journal, possibly ones that are similar to your study that you're trying to publish, and see how they've been written and organized, and follow that. So this is not difficult to find out. It's not a mystery to find out what the order of contents is, but as an editor-in-chief, I can assure you that I receive many manuscripts and have in all of the journals in which I've worked that don't follow this guidance, and it can lead to rejection if you're very unlucky. If you're lucky, you may be asked to reorganize the manuscript, but I believe that there's absolutely no excuse for not getting this right at the beginning, because all the information you need about organizing a manuscript is easily available to you. Now, what is the organization of a manuscript about? Why are they organized in this way? Well, this is essentially what we call signposting, and that serves 2 functions. One, it helps the reader to make their way through your article. It also helps them to know what to expect under the different sections of the article. And there's another aspect to this. The organization of a manuscript helps you as an author to write your manuscript and to know what to put into the various sections. And rather than talking repeatedly about the actual order of contents, what I want to do is look at, under various headings, typical contents and what you should, and in some cases should not, be putting under those headings. So what I want to do is to help you here to write better manuscripts by knowing what is required under the various sections of the manuscript. So we'll move on to looking at that. So the standards for manuscript writing. Of course, there are other standards for writing in terms of how the article should be presented. Some journals are very particular about this and about font size and spacing and so forth. All of these bits of information are available on the guidance for the journal, which is easily found on the journal web page. Well, I'm not going to talk about these things today, but remember, this is the organization of the manuscript is only one aspect of that organization. So you should check. Now, most journals these days, certainly nearly all North American journals, the ones which are not medical, and a great many nursing journals, certainly within the Wiley and the Elsevier stables, which are probably the biggest publishers of nursing journals, require authors to use the APA, the American Psychological Association guidance. So sometimes they don't provide copious guidance about how to lay out your manuscript, but they refer you to those guidelines which are easily available online. Medical journals and other journals publishing using medical subjects often use a different kind of publishing standard, and it's the American Medical Association standard. And one of the main differences between these two ways of presenting manuscripts is not in the organization, but in the way that the references are presented. So that's just something else to be looking out for when you look for the organization of the manuscript and the way to write it. How are the references done and how are they collected together at the end in a reference list? So before I start, I always like to refer people to what I call the 4 rules of writing, and we may talk about these in more detail at some other point. The 4 rules of writing are the following. The first of the 4 rules is to read the guidelines. Now, I've referred to this already, but as I say, what you're required to put into a manuscript is not a mystery. It's available in the guidelines. Then set yourself realistic targets and count the words. Seek some criticism of your manuscript. In other words, get someone else, especially if you are an inexperienced writer, get somebody else to take a look at it. And, as I always say, treat a rejection as the start of the next submission. Now, really only the first of these 4 points is relevant to today, although the last point there, treating a rejection as the start of the next submission, is also very important, because you may well decide, if you get rejected somewhere, and you should always decide to resubmit your manuscript to another journal, you may then have to check the guidance again and check the organization of the manuscript. This is the current landing page of my own journal at the moment, Nurse Education and Practice. It is slightly out of date because our impact factor is much bigger than that now, but what I wanted to show you here was that on the landing page, and this is the same for all journals, I'm not here to advertise my journal, by the way, I want this to be generic. On the landing page, you will always find prominently displayed Guide for Author. It may be called Guidance for Authors or Publication Guidance or something else, but you will find a link there which will tell you exactly what you need to know about everything to do with writing your manuscript and to do with submitting it. And if you follow the guidance closely, you have a much higher chance of being accepted. If you follow the guidance closely, you've a very high chance of being put forward by the editor-in-chief to a handling editor, and thereafter to be accepted. If you don't get put forward to a handling editor, in other words, if you are desk rejected, then you've no chance of being published. So check the guidance, get it right, get the organization and the presentation of the manuscript right, and that will make a good impression on the editor-in-chief. And editors-in-chief are very busy people. I can vouch for that, and we don't have time to deal with manuscripts which are not following our guidance. So the journal guidelines tell you a few things. They tell you about the length of the manuscript that's required. They tell you about the layout, but relevant to today, they tell you about the organization. And finally, they will also tell you about the referencing system. And I've already referred to this, but a typical order of contents before we delve into more detail looks as follows: title, abstract, introduction and background. These may be run together. The method section, results, discussion, conclusion, and of course the references. So what I want to do is to proceed through this lecture and talk about each of these in turn for about the next 60 minutes or so. By the way, obviously I can't take questions in this session, but you will have my email on the final slide, and you're welcome to email me or contact me by WeChat, or keep your questions until we meet again. Now, it's worth remembering that an academic article has a shape. I'm not sure how best to describe this in a way that you would be familiar with. We call this an hourglass shape, or a shape like a spool for thread. Anyway, the point is that articles are bigger near the beginning and bigger at the end in two senses. One, the beginning and the end usually contain more words, but also they are read more. Now clearly the abstract will not be as big as the introduction as shown here, but the abstract also has a shape with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And increasingly journals require you to not only put the abstract in the correct order, obviously, but within the abstract to structure that with headings and subheadings. And I will show you that here. So essentially there's a shape to an article that starts broadly, narrows down into more focused areas and also shorter areas, and then broadens out again into the discussion. So what I'll do is I'll go again through each of these areas in turn, but I will start with the title. So let's start with the title. Now, you mustn't forget that titles are very, very important, and they're actually something like an advertisement for your article. They're a very important way to attract people to look at your article and then to decide whether or not to read it. And in terms of readership, and this is something that's very easy to gauge from readings on the internet, the largest group of readers will read your title. Then we'll move through the other sections later, but slightly fewer people may read the abstract, and far fewer people will read the rest of the article. So the title's an important advert, and it needs to be done properly in order to attract readers to your article, and it also needs to tell readers exactly what the article is about, and it shouldn't be too long. Therefore, there are one or two things to tell you about titles. First of all, a title should be as short as possible. Some journals give very restricted numbers of words for titles, usually around 20 words, but that's getting big. Some are as few as 15 words. And I believe that some of the APA journals, the American Psychological Association journals, are even shorter. So you need to get as much information in there as you possibly can, and the best way to do that is to be absolutely clear what your article is about. And they should be, of course, clearly related to the topic of the paper. That seems rather obvious, but sometimes people complain, particularly reviewers, that the contents of an article do not match the title. They obviously must match up. And it's becoming clear because of internet searching and the way that we read on the internet and the way that things are found and come to the top of searches, that the title should contain the vital information at the beginning. So the aspect of the paper, the aspect of the study that you think is most important should be at the beginning. I'll show you some examples here of what I mean. So, for example, it's considered better to write a systematic review of traditional Chinese medicine rather than traditional Chinese medicine, a systematic review. It's important to tell people what the method for the paper is, and that seems to be the most important thing to do. Somebody who is searching for an article in this area will already be looking for articles on traditional Chinese medicine, but if they see one that says systematic review, and they see that easily by having it on the left-hand side where it's red, then that will attract them much more to that article than if you used the second title. Similarly, a randomized control of traditional Chinese medicine versus conventional medicine is considered better than traditional Chinese medicine versus conventional medicine, a randomized controlled trial. Again, people will be already looking for articles in this subject area, but they will be looking for articles that are of a high level of evidence, and a randomized controlled trial, of course, fulfills that. So it's much better to tell them what the method is and then to tell them what the subject is about. Now, these are just bits of advice and information coming from publishers about how to structure titles of articles. And by the way, these titles are completely made up. I didn't say these don't come from particular studies. Next, the abstract. Now, similarly to the title, the abstract is also very important. And the abstract is an important gateway to your article. You'll see we've already dealt with titles which are widely read. The next most widely read is the abstract. And honestly, when we know this as researchers, we also know this as editors and publishers. Some people never read more than the abstract. And to be quite honest, the abstract should tell you everything that you need to know about the article in terms of the aims, objectives, methods, results, and what your conclusions are. Of course, reading the rest of the article will give you those details. For example, if the abstract says that the study is a randomized controlled trial, then you will want to know more about that if you want to repeat it or to use it in a systematic review. So you do need to read the paper to get the details of how to follow that particular study. But anyway, abstracts are very important, and of course abstracts are made free to read by publishers on the internet for obvious reasons. It's supposed to attract you then to download or possibly even to purchase the article. So some of the ideas about abstracts, these days they are nearly always structured, and they will inevitably be less than 400 words, in some cases much less than 400 words, sometimes only 200, and I've seen journals where the number of words is even less than that. Now I'm going to give you a proposed structure for an abstract, and it looks a little bit like the structure for a whole article. An aim, a background, design, methods, results, and conclusions, and you've got to get all that into very few words. Now, two things about abstracts. One, I would always advise you to write the abstract last once you've written the paper, because that way you will know exactly what you want to say in the abstract. You may well have a working abstract at the beginning of the process, but always go back and revise it. Go over your abstract several times, get other people to read it, make sure that it's clear and it can be understood. Remember, this is one thing that the editor-in-chief will read, and if the abstract does not make sense and has things missing from it, then you will not be put forward to an editor. So that's one thing, is to make sure that you work very hard on your abstract, probably best to do it after you've written the paper. The other thing is that some journals still prefer you not to have it structured in this way, and I think they're dying out, these journals. There aren't so many of them, but nevertheless, one hint I can give you is to use a structure like this, even if the article, even if the abstract is not required to be structured. So put in these headings and subheadings and write the abstract according to those, and then if they do not want the structure, simply take out the headings. But the most important thing is that you begin with the aims. Tell the reader, and of course the editor-in-chief and the reviewers who will be looking at your article, what this article sets out to do, and then at the end have some conclusions, because the conclusions should be something that the reader scans down to see what your study means. Other things, in case I don't mention these in subsequent slides, when you come to the methods, you should include two things. You should include the number of people involved, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and you should give some idea of when the study was completed. In the results sections, look carefully to see whether the journals want you to include statistical parameters like p-values or not. Most do, most medical journals do, but some don't. Again, this is a general piece of guidance about an abstract here. Don't forget to look specifically at the guidance for the journal. And I have given you a reference here to Nurse, Author and Editor, an article written by me many years ago on writing an abstract, which you can take a look at. I will provide a PDF version of these PowerPoints, and you will be able to click through on that to writing an abstract. I will also talk about Nurse, Author and Editor at the end, as I will do in all my presentations. Now, something else that's important about abstracts is keywords and discoverability. And again, this is information that is coming from publishers about how best to write an abstract. And the abstract includes, of course, the title and the keywords. So we're looking at title, abstract, and keywords together here. First of all, construct a clear descriptive title, as I've said, short, clear, and saying exactly what you've done. Reiterate key phrases and key words, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. Try to achieve congruence between the title, the abstract, and the keywords. In other words, try to use the same words within each one. Don't vary them. So what I'll show you here is what I consider to be a well-optimized abstract. Again, this is fictional, it's not from a real study, but it's written in such a way that it will demonstrate my point. So this is called a review of false memory in older adults. I'm not going to read everything as follows, but it will have a name, it will have a background, methods, results, conclusions, and keywords. Now, the important thing here is that I have used the same words throughout. I've used false memory, older adults, memory, false, older adults, memory again. I haven't used different words, and this gives, I'm sorry it's slightly obscured by the video there, but this gives 18 terms that are common. Now that is more likely to be found on an internet search than a less well optimized abstract, which I'll show you next. So this is a poorly optimized abstract, and it's called False Remembering in the Senior Population, and you'll notice that the keywords are different, all correct but different. And here there are only 9 terms in common because I've varied what I've said, and none of the keywords represents what's said in either the title or in the abstract. They're all perfectly good words to use, but you should also use plain words and just check to see what the journal will allow you in terms of the number of words that are used as keywords, and also if they want them to be official mesh terms, or if you can just use plain English. And increasingly journals are moving towards using plain English words. So the secret here is to try and get as many words in common between the title, the abstract, and the keywords. Points to remember: people tend to search for specific things, so don't just use one word. So for example, if it's about children's nursing, use children's nurses, not just nurses. Ensure that the title contains the most important words that relate to the topic. Key phrases need to make sense within the title and the abstract and flow well. And it's best to focus on a maximum of 3 or 4 different key phrases. I would say 3 or even 2. The more you focus, the more words in common you get. But the point is, don't go for too many key phrases. And finally, read it. To always read and reread your abstract to make sure that it reads well. I must say something specific to colleagues whose first language is not English, and I see this now and again from Chinese authors. The manuscript is very, very well written, and often the abstract isn't. And I think what's happened is that a translator has worked on the main manuscript, but then the academic has done the abstract after that, and it doesn't look so good. So sometimes the abstract can prevent the review of a very good article if it's not well written. Then the introduction to the paper, and I'm going to try and differentiate between introduction and background, although the diagram here uses background. They're very similar, but there are some slight differences between the two. So the introduction should orient you to the article, and it should start wide and get down to something more specific. So it should tell you, it should start off with sort of what it says there. So what? Why is this important to do? What is the gap that you're trying to fill? And end down there with a research aim. So it's quite useful to structure an introduction or indeed an introduction and background with these 5 points. Now only point 1 is strictly speaking introduction. The rest are the background. And sometimes these are given separate headings, and it's always best to do that. So the introduction should place the study in context. Perhaps that's policy, practice, research, or education. We're lucky in nursing that we can often find one of those into which our article falls. It should contain a problem statement. What is the problem? Why is the problem worth studying? Why are you studying the problem? And why would anyone be interested? So try to grab the attention of the potential reader, and of course the first reader is the editor-in-chief, and then reviewers. Try to grab their attention in the introduction and make it clear to them why the study is important. Again, I have an article in Nurse Author and Editor which is titled I Say Introduction, You Say Background, giving some information about writing these, but also slightly differentiating between the two things. Then the background, which can be a section of the introduction, or it may be a separate section altogether. The The background is essentially a literature review, not a systematic literature review, but it should be containing the literature that supports your article. It should demonstrate what's already known about the topic and what gaps the paper will fill. It should identify the questions to be addressed in the paper, and it should end with a research question or a hypothesis in the case of, for example, a clinical trial. So try to remember that research questions are statements with a question mark at the end. They're not an aim, they're not an hypothesis, they're a question. So for example, these are actually from some of my own research. Are practice nurses better than GPs at removing earwax? Does continuing professional development improve nurses' management skills? Why do older nurses leave the profession? These are all very different kinds of studies, obviously, but you can fit a research question around all of these. And qualitative studies should have research questions as much as quantitative studies. Hypotheses are slightly different. There will be a relationship between X and Y. There will be a difference between X and Y, and X will be better than Y at. The difference between a research question and an hypothesis, which follows on often in quantitative research from your research question, is that these are specifically testable by statistical methods. Which brings us nicely on to the methods. Now I'm going to talk here mainly about quantitative methods. I will mention qualitative, but that quantitative is much more my expertise, and a great deal of what we write and what I present about quantitative methods actually to some extent applies to qualitative methods, but not all of it, clearly. So the method should be written such that somebody else can conduct your study, and there's this nice 5-step diagram which I came across, which I'm going to use to try to explain this before I go on to tell a little bit more about the methods. So you should try and follow these steps. Step 1, remember your methods section serves two purposes. It helps readers to understand your study, and it will help others to replicate it, which is often done and necessary, particularly in clinical trials. But also, if other people want to use this design to test something else, they may well be able to replicate it. So remember that it should be written in such a way that it can be read and repeated. That's at the heart of the scientific method. Step 2, constantly provide enough information for full replication. So even if the journal doesn't require it, detailed methods are a key to rigorous, transparent and open science. Step 3, try to imagine yourself replicating the study in future years. So read over it and think, what information would you need to reproduce your own work? And don't forget to capture any adjustments or changes that you made to, for example, a published protocol. I'm very much in favour of this. Try to consider using a visual aid. In other words, try to consider having a diagram that will help someone to understand your methods. And I'm very much in favour of flowcharts, decision trees, checklists. All of these make it more clear and they help readers to interpret the study. Now, systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials these days have the PRISMA and CONSORT systems respectively, which all reputable journals use for presenting those studies, and they are a checklist and a flow diagram. So these are built into those studies, but other studies can use them too, and you can make something up yourself if you think it helps a reader to understand how you've done your study. And finally, step 5, adhere to ethical standards and reporting guidelines. So ethics must be reported within your methods section, in other words, how you obtained ethical permission, but make sure that the study is done ethically and that this is clear within the methods section. So just to recap, the methods section should have a design, it's always a good idea to open your methods section with a clear description and a simple description of your design. Then the methods should have information about sampling, data collection, analysis. And of course, as I've already said, there should be a statement about ethics here. Now, I just want to do this very quickly because I don't want to turn this into a research methods lecture, but just to be clear that the designs can be either qualitative or quantitative, and the quantitative can be RCTs or surveys. Qualitative could be ethnography, grounded theory, and you should also include something about the type of the design. Was it cross-sectional or longitudinal? That's probably not completely comprehensive, but if you look at that, and it's quite perhaps useful to have this as a checklist when you're writing a paper, you've got to describe quantitative or qualitative, what particular design did you use, and did you do it once or several times. So you've got to describe some aspect of what's there in your design statement, and that's probably only going to be done in one sentence. Sampling is very important. You need to describe the population from which your sample was drawn. What were the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What was the type of sampling? Was it random or was it convenience? How did you gain access to participants? Did you do it or was it done by someone else? So random, simple, cluster, stratified, for example. There are other types of randomization these days. You need to be clear and describe what you've done. It could be sequential or convenience, for example. And you must mention the sample size considerations. You must say how you decided on that sample size. Now, for quantitative work, that's easy. It's done by power analysis. For qualitative, it's not so easy, but you do need to make some statement about how you decided to stop collecting data. Data collection. Which instruments did you use? Why did you use them? Mention something about validity or reliability for quantitative studies, and for qualitative studies, mention what your criteria were for ensuring rigor. How did you ensure confirmability, for example? And if you used a translated questionnaire, which might be quite common in China, and I've already myself worked on translations of questionnaires into Chinese, then you must describe the process of translation. Reliability, very quickly, you need probably to mention, if possible, internal consistency, test, retest, intra-rater or inter-rater. You won't have done all of these, but you do need to make sure that if any of these was done, or if it was done in previous articles which you're citing, make sure you mention that. In terms of validity, say something about construct validity and make reference to content, criterion, discriminant or factorial. Again, not all of these will have been done, but to what extent did you ensure something about construct validity? And then for the analysis, it goes without saying that you need to specify which statistical tests you used and which packages were used. Did you use SPSS or Stata or R? Now, every section of a paper is important, of course, but what I want to talk about now is the results section, and this is where I find some inexperienced authors, but even experienced authors on occasions, find some difficulty. I don't know if you understand the cartoon, but results should stand alone, by which I mean they shouldn't be making reference to other aspects of the paper. They shouldn't be pointing forward. And also when you present results, they should be presented certainly in quantitative results as tables or figures. Then those need to stand alone. Someone should be able to look at a table from your results section or a diagram and understand without reading anything else what that means. Of course, you will be writing about it in your results section, but you should make sure that if you produce any tables or figures, they can be understood without reference to the rest of the content. And it says there, tip 5 at the bottom, sorry, slightly obscured by the video, but results present findings without interpretation. And I'll come back to that and show you tell you what I mean by that. That is very, very important. So results. Just state the results, don't discuss them. And this is one of the errors that some inexperienced writers make. So don't start telling people how interesting or significant or what the meaning of your results are in the results section. Just say what the results were. So for example, if you're reporting on the demographic aspects and you want to show how many men and how many women there were, and for example in a sample of nurses, if you got, it would be unusual for you to get 50% men and 50% women. Nursing is still predominantly female. But if you got 50% male and 50% female in a sample of nurses, just leave it there. Just state that in the results. Don't say this is surprising because. Leave that for the discussion. So the results should just be stated and not discussed. And I would strongly, for quantitative papers, to have an order in which you present the results. So I would present the descriptive statistics first, in other words, the demographics, the bare numbers regarding the people in your study. And also with descriptive statistics, don't repeat everything in the text that is said in the tables. Point to the table and perhaps bring out some highlights, but don't repeat absolutely everything. If you've got a table with 20 lines of demographics in it, there's nothing more boring or unnecessary to read, and it also takes up a great deal of space, which you won't necessarily have if you repeat all of the descriptives. Just point to the ones that are maybe unusual or you want to draw attention to without any interpretation. And just in case I forget to mention this, when you come to your discussion, try to avoid repeating results there. You can refer to them in general, but don't go giving p-values and means and averages and all the rest of it in the discussion section. Try to be general and draw from your results and discuss them, but we'll come back to that. So after the descriptive statistics, I would then look at any inferential statistics, in other words, the relationships amongst the data and between sets of data. So for example, this would be your t-tests and correlations, ANOVAs, tests like that, chi-squares and so forth. And finally, if you've done any multivariate statistics, this is not compulsory, but you may have done them, they would come last. So for example, you may use your descriptive data and based on your inferential statistics, look at some multivariate relationships, for example, regression or factor analysis. So you may look at structures within the data and causes within the data as much as you can, for example, by multiple regression. So that's just a suggested order, and it's the usual order, and it makes sense to present the descriptive statistics and the inferential statistics and then the multivariate statistics if you've done them. If you are presenting a qualitative study, again, you still need some descriptive statistics at the beginning. The number of people, who they were, for example, that should be presented. Make sure that you refer to all tables and figures. This is a common mistake made by many authors. And the other important thing is that the tables and figures should be in the correct order. Don't start by citing table 2 and then table 1. Table 1 should come first. And the tables may need to be renumbered. And be careful if you are asked to revise a manuscript and to reorganize the contents, because, for example, you may start reorganizing the contents of the results section, and you may find that the order of your tables is no longer the same as it was when you originally wrote the paper. You may be asked to remove tables or figures and to put them into supplementary material. So make sure that the tables run consecutively. Don't go from table 1, 2 to table 6. Make sure it goes 2, 3, 4. Very simple things, but they very often occur. See them regularly as an editor, and it's up to you to get these things right. Now, tables and figures, these are almost essential adjuncts to any results section, particularly important in quantitative studies, but I would also urge you to consider them in qualitative studies too. And one way of making sure that you don't exceed your word count in a qualitative paper is to put some of the quotes into tables. And I have that reliably from an expert in qualitative research. As I say, my area is more quantitative. So either kind of research can be helped with tables and figures, but there are ways of presenting these. And I would strongly urge you not to use the table function in Word. This is not very good for production. I would draw your tables as open tables. I'll show you an example of this here. And I would make them simple. And if you're again in any doubt about how to present tables or figures, take a look at a typical edition of the journal and see how people have done it there and follow that style. So see how others present these. Don't use raw statistical outputs from, for example, SPSS. These are of no use at all. They're difficult to read. They contain too much information. Now you can in SPSS create quite nice looking tables using the table function, but I often think, to be honest, you're better just starting and doing them yourself. Be what's called parsimonious. This is difficult to describe, but what I mean by being parsimonious is that you should present as much information as possible in as little space as possible. And remember, the tables should stand alone. And if you need to present copious tables, or if you've got tables that are really very, very big, can you produce those as an appendix, or as is increasingly possible in journals, put the material online as a supplement and not in the main paper? This can be very helpful for qualitative research. It can also be helpful for systematic reviews where you've summarized all of the papers. If you've got half a dozen papers in a systematic review, that's quite easy to put into a table. But if you've got 20, that's going to take up a lot of space. And what I would recommend you do is put a full table as a supplement and a summary in the actual text of your manuscript. So here's an example of a figure which is logical. It does make sense if you look at it closely, but you would never ever consider putting a figure like this into an academic paper. It's published in a report about the Afghan war, for example, but honestly that's far too complicated to read. You cannot take that all in at once, that's the point. So don't present highly complicated figures with arrows going in all directions. It's no use. Again, tables that look like this. Again, this table makes sense if you look carefully at it and take your time, but it doesn't exactly convey what's happening at a glance, and I don't consider that to be a very good table. I think it could have been presented much better. For example, however, I think this is an excellent table. It's a very simple table, but everything that you need to know is in that table, and it's presented as an open format. It's not presented using the table function in Word. So the title, for example, gives you the research question. The first line under national totals gives you obviously the years working from 22 back to 1996 of those who favour, those who oppose and don't know the answer to that question. And then in the bottom you've got the demographics. So everything you need to know about that particular table, or what the result that they're trying to present there, is there. You don't need to read anything else. So I think that's an excellent example of a table. Of course, your tables will not all be able to look like that, but it just gives you some idea of what you should be aiming for. The other really nice thing about the table is it's small and it's short. Okay, moving on, we've been through the sort of middle part of the paper, the small, thin, the waste of the paper. By waste, I don't mean, I mean the hourglass, this narrow bit of the hourglass, and the results and in the methods. And now we're beginning to widen out again into the discussion. And actually the diagram on the right-hand side there is quite useful, saying how you should structure a discussion, a mini synopsis, restatement of the main findings, significant meaning, and so forth. But we'll come to that in some details in a few minutes. So the discussion should round off the article. In other words, it should start off narrow and it should end up broader, as the shape of an article suggests. So one way is to summarize the findings and then to state the relevance, look at similarities, differences, unexpected results, what the limitations are, any future work, and then the conclusions from that work. Some people have a great deal of difficulty writing a discussion section. It's the one section of a paper that people find difficult and often ask me for help with. And it's not just how should I write a discussion section, very generally, it's how should I begin a discussion section. And I think beginning the discussion section is very important. It's very important to get that right. So in a little bit more detail, the discussion should close the circle. That's what it says in the middle of the slide, closing the circle. That means several things. It means taking the reader to some extent back to the beginning of the article, but also closing it down by giving closure, by giving a conclusion to the article, what it means. So there are various elements to the discussion that should be included, and various ways in which it should be presented. It should discuss the findings to the research questions, so please make sure that your discussion doesn't take the reader into some other realm away from your paper. Again, this is often a fault that reviewers point out. They say the discussion doesn't actually bear any relationship to the results, for example, and that's not going to do your paper much good in the review process. So you have to keep the aims of the study uppermost in your mind, and the research questions uppermost in your mind. And the research questions, of course, are answered by the methods and in the results section, but the discussion section is a section in which you discuss and describe how they were answered and the extent to which they were answered, and what it actually means. So some people find discussions very difficult to write, and I can understand that, but that's something to keep uppermost in your mind. Sometimes, and I do this myself, on a whiteboard or on a post-it or some way where you can see it when you're doing your writing. Keep the research questions up there, actually written, so that you can see them. So as I say, don't take the reader somewhere else. Make sure that you are discussing the findings to the actual research questions that you were addressing, whether it's a quantitative study or whether it's a qualitative study. Make sure that you do include the limitations of the study. No study is perfect, and you can include the limitations within a subheading within the discussion if you want. I would probably leave it until the end of the discussion and before the conclusion, and make sure that you state what the limitations are. So, for example, you may have set out with good intentions to get a sample size of 500 people and you only got 300. Make sure that people know that that was a limitation and what the implications of that limitation were. All studies have some limitations. If any study that didn't have limitations would be the perfect study that answered all the questions we want to know, but studies always have limitations. And limitations are there so that other people reading them can then take those into account and perhaps improve on those limitations when they come to carrying out their own study, or they may also guide you in what you're going to do better studies in future. Remember, an article is a published record of what you've done, so these things need to be included. Don't overstate findings, even important findings. Clearly, you will state the findings in the results, but don't exaggerate them in the discussion. Don't make them seem more important than they are. Your study is not definitive, it's not the end. Try not to qualify things too much by saying that they're interesting or that they are astonishing or that this is really important. What you're trying to do is, remember that first bullet point, you're simply trying to discuss the findings to the research questions. So an academic paper is not a piece of journalism as such. It's an accurate record of what you've done. It should be unemotional and, again, not exaggerated. So don't overstate your findings. But likewise, don't completely undermine your study by trying to find lots and lots of artificial limitations. Sometimes people can put so many limitations in that reviewers say, why was this study even submitted? So make sure that you don't undermine the study by looking for limitations that aren't there. Just make sure that you assess these properly. It's a difficult thing to describe this without looking at a particular study. But again, if you're in any doubt about these things, one of the best things that you can do is to take a look at another published paper similar to yours and see what they've done. You must have some implications and recommendations for policy practice, and particularly for future research. Journals are actually increasingly asking for this to be in a separate subheading, sometimes after the conclusion. However, they may not ask for that, and I think the discussion is the place to have these, again, probably under some kind of separate subheading. So try to again, without exaggerating, without putting emotions into it, try just matter-of-factly to describe what the implications of your study are, what it means. And of course, within nursing, we often, as I said at the beginning, can address policy, practice, education, or just straightforward research. And again, this will have been stated in the introduction section, so you should know which areas of policy, practice, or research, or education your paper has implications. You should know which area of knowledge to which you're contributing and state that here. And relate everything back to the aims of the study and where they achieved. You will have restated at the beginning of the discussion, as I suggest, what the aims were, and then you will come to the end of the discussion and have some reflection on that and the extent to which they were achieved. So I've got a few more things to say about this, but I've also written an article, another one in Nurse, Author and Editor, which you can click through to, starting the discussion section of a manuscript. I'm often asked about writing discussion sections, and people don't as often say, how do I write a discussion section? I do get asked that sometimes. They often find it very difficult to know how to start a discussion section. So I've already referred to this, but I will reiterate. How to start a discussion section should be with a restatement of what the aims of the study were. Following that, in a few bullet points, what the main findings were. Now those bullet points, 3 or 4 at the very most probably, they can then be used to structure the rest of the discussion. In fact, they can form the subheadings for the remainder of the discussion. So it gives you a very simple formula for writing it. After you have discussed all those findings, then you can come to what the potential implications are and then the limitations. Now, 2 things about presenting the results or discussing the results in the discussion section. It really is advisable not to restate numbers, figures and statistical parameters. I've already said that. Try to discuss things generally here. If people want to know what the results were, they can refer back to the results section. So try not to repeat things here. The other thing that I'm often asked about is how much of the literature in the introduction should be referred to here, and can I introduce new literature? And the answers to those are not easy, but you clearly cannot refer to all of the literature that was in your introduction or background section, but you should refer to the aspects of that literature that your results either confirm or refute or in some way illuminate those findings from other studies. So don't refer to it all. As for introducing new material into the discussion, that's really, there's not a clear answer to that. My tendency would be not to do that, but there may in some cases be a case for doing that. It's a bit of a judgment. So I don't have a clear answer about whether you should introduce new literature here or not, but my instinct is that you probably shouldn't. So to start the discussion section of a paper, restate the findings and then bullet point or just present in a brief statement what the main findings were. Use those main findings to structure the paper thereafter before you then start to draw out the implications and then the limitations. So the discussion section is not the end of a paper, but it's obviously it's a very important part of the paper. I will be honest with you and say that discussion sections are not always read in great detail by other readers. They're more often interested in your simple findings and your results section, but nevertheless the discussion sections are read by reviewers who want to know what your work means, so you should put a great deal of attention into your discussion section. Now, the final section of most papers is the conclusion section. Very commonly, this is presented as a separate section from the discussion. Sometimes they are included in the discussion section, but either way, they should have their own heading or subheading. So you should draw attention to your conclusion. The reason for that is that people often only read the abstract to a paper and then the conclusion if they get the full paper, in order to see whether the paper is worth reading, making a contribution to their field, or worth referring to for the methods. So there is a great deal of similarity between certain sections of a paper, An abstract and a conclusion obviously have some similarities, but they're not exactly the same. And clearly some of the material that's in the main body of the paper, particularly in the discussion, will also be in the conclusion. But you've got to be aware of that and not repeat things too much. Try to express things slightly differently in each of these sections. That can be difficult in using English as a second language. That may be where you need some help with writing papers. But there's a saying about trying to make a point to someone, and that saying goes as follows. It says, tell somebody what you're going to tell them it, and then tell them it again. And this is exactly what happens in an academic paper. The abstract tells people what we're going to tell them if they read the complete paper. The main body of the paper or the article, consisting of the introduction, the methods, results, and the discussion, that's where you tell them what you've done, why you've done it, and what you've found and what it means. And then in the conclusion, you've somehow got to do that again, but in a very short space. So I would consider the conclusion to be your final attempt or your final chance to tell people what your paper was about, but write it in such a way that you realize that this may well be read before any other part of the paper. So as it says here under those in that diagram on the right hand side, restate the thesis, summarize the main points, and then sort of wrap up. So making use of a diagram here, I'm going to try to show you and then discuss a little bit about how the conclusion should complete the article. I reiterate that the conclusion is often read before any other part of the article, so it's very important to get this right. It should go, like any aspect of the paper, it should have a shape to it, and in the case of a conclusion, that shape is from specific out to general. And the three things to do here are to restate what the thesis was, not what the aims were, but what you were trying to do in the paper. Summarize the key points from the paper. Most likely they will be the findings, and then to give some future work and recommendations. Yes, you will already have done some of this in your discussion, but don't be afraid to do it again here, and to do it but much more succinctly, much more in much less space. Okay, so just to go through that once again, the conclusion, as the diagram says there, so the point is, so what you're really trying to do here is, having said all that in your discussion, having gone into it in great detail, having in a sense philosophized about your findings in the discussion, the conclusion should really bring the reader to the point. So again, a brief summary of what the paper shows, what it was set out to do and what it shows. You're talking about a sentence here, not a paragraph. What the main implications were, you may well have had 5 to 10 implications in your discussion section. Just try to think, what are the main ones here? What are the ones that really made a difference and that I want to draw to the attention of the reader? A statement on future lines of inquiry. So don't go into great details about possible avenues of research, but where this research could go in future and why it could go there. Don't use any references in the conclusion. This is not the place to start including references. That should all have been done in the main body of the article. Don't introduce any new ideas here. Don't put in afterthoughts or anything that comes to you then. If any new ideas, anything that comes out of the research should already have been in the discussion section. So don't use the conclusion section to mop up any odd ideas that you had. Leave them aside. So no new ideas. And I would strongly recommend in the conclusion, rather like I've done on a few of these slides, is to use bullet points, maybe not all the way through, but and you can use these in other parts of the paper too. So when you give the main implications are 1, 2, and 3, and put them with a bullet point and make them stand out from the rest of the text. So that's really all I want to say about the conclusion of a paper. In terms of relative lengths of aspects of a paper, I'll just discuss that briefly. So before I conclude, and this conclusion is my conclusion to the lecture, not the conclusion to an article, but before I go on to that and reiterate what we've done in this session, I wanted to say a word about the relative lengths of sections of an article. Now this will primarily depend on how long the journal articles are, in fact how many words you're allowed to use. It's common in UK journals and in many journals to give you a specific word length. Some journals still give you a manuscript length, and that plus they give you very clear guidelines on how it should be laid out, so they know exactly how long it will be and how it will look when it's produced. But mostly, I would say 90% of journals give you a word count. That can vary between about 3,000 words up to maybe 7,000 words in some journals, but most commonly journals give you around 5,000 words. And I'm not going to do any addition or a sum here. I'm going to give you a rough idea of what the lengths of the various sections are. It may not add up to 5,000 words. It's just a rough idea. I think that the introduction to a paper should be no longer than 500 words. That's an introduction without background. So if you're doing an introduction section, it should be no more than maybe 2 pages of double-spaced A4 paper, so that's 500 words. Your introduction section could, if it's then followed by a background, could have a background section of perhaps 1,000 words at the very most. Then your method sections and your results sections should each be no longer than about 500 words. That seems quite short, but they should be quite short and succinct. And of course, both can be supported by figures and tables, but particularly the results section. So try to say as much in the tables and as little in the text as you possibly can. Then your discussion section could be perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 words long if you've got a lot to discuss. But you can vary that, of course. If the maximum length of an article is 5,000 words in a journal, you do not have to go to 5,000 words. The editors will always be happy if you are shorter, because it takes less effort to review and to edit, but you cannot go over. And then finally, your conclusion section. I would say here that if you used 500 words to conclude your article, that would probably be too many, but you would have that many left over if you made the other sections that length. The point I'm trying to make is, the one that we made right at the beginning, is that the discussion sections and the introduction sections to papers are by far the longest. If you have a maximum length for a paper, as you undoubtedly will, if you happen to have to make, for example, your methods section very long or your results section very long, if they're particularly complex, you will have to cut down on the other sections. So just be aware of that. It's a balance. So there are no rules ever about how many words any section should be, but they should relatively, it would be very unusual if a methods section was bigger than a discussion section, for example. So just bear that in mind. And of course, that brings us to the great skill, which we will talk about to some extent in a subsequent session, of using as few words as possible and of cutting down on words. So just to conclude, I've discussed today the standard organisation of a manuscript. In terms of title, we looked at that: short, succinct and descriptive. Abstracts, structured and with congruence between the title, the body of the abstract, and the keywords. Introduction or background, however the journals want to use that, but the introduction should give place the paper in context, and the background should discuss the relevant literature, what the gaps are, what you're going to do to fill them, and what the aims of the study are, and probably with a research question. The methods should include a clear statement of the design, and then make sure that you describe the methods very clearly, taking into account some of the things that I said about validity, reliability, and other and the analysis and the sampling. Results, they should be succinct, using good, clear tables which tell you as much as possible in one table. In other words, it should stand alone. And then the discussion section should round off the paper, taking the reader back to the beginning of the paper and trying to draw out what the implications are. And I've given you some ideas about how you could possibly begin writing and structure a discussion. And finally, your conclusion. This should be, again, quite short. And bear in mind, as I've said several times, that the title and the abstract are very frequently read, because these are freely available online. If someone then gets a hold of your full text, they will probably jump very quickly down to the conclusions. So the conclusion of a paper is very, very important, and it may often be the only part of a full paper that's read. Then, of course, the references. I haven't discussed these here, but they should come at the end. Please make sure that you use the correct referencing system for the journal. There's nothing annoys editors in chief more than if the wrong referencing system has been used. I've made reference several times in this session to nurse, author and editor, or N, A and E, and here it is here. I may well have mentioned it in the previous session, and I may mention it again, but I just want to reiterate in case anyone wasn't present. Nurse, author and editor is now published by Wiley, and it's the journal of the International Academy of Nursing Editors. And it is an excellent journal, and it's very attractive because it's free to download. You do not have to pay to access the material in Nurse, Author and Editor, and you can set yourself an email alert for the content. You don't even have to subscribe to it. And in addition to the articles that you saw that I've written here, I've written a great many other articles in Nurse, Author and Editor, as have many people, and they're all of great interest to potential authors. All giving very useful advice about how to write better manuscripts. So I would really urge you to take a look at Nurse, Author and Editor. So once again, thank you very much for listening today, and just to give you these details again, that's probably the best email on which to contact me, my editorial email, nepeditor@outlook.com. I know that you have difficulty following people on Twitter in China, but if you wanted to follow me, that's my Twitter address. Please be aware that that's a personal Twitter address. It's not professional, so you may not agree with everything I say there. If you want to check anything about my own research and publication credentials, then you can check my ORCID page, and the URL is there. And of course, if you want to keep in contact with me by WeChat, then you can scan the WeChat URL, and you're welcome to contact me there if you have any questions or comments afterwards. So once again, thank you very much. I will be back with you in person next session, and I look forward very much to seeing you then. So I hope you found that useful. Once again, thank you and goodbye.